very glad to say that Katharine Stout is here today, who is currently head of programs at the ICA, where they also have a very busy weekend. You're doing the Artist Biennial, 4 days of films, screenings, symposia.
Yes, we have, opened on Thursday and continuing through to Sunday, including Lisson's very own Christian Jankowski retrospective.
Yeah, you gave a very good talk here a couple of months ago. So we'll be rushing to the ICA afterwards. But part of the reason to do this talk about Richard was he talks very well about his work, but he also tends to look at it quite specifically, and it's quite nice to have a more open discussion. And I titled the talk vaguely, A Walk as a Work, because in a way that's where it all stems from. And I thought, yes, a walk can be a work, which is what he's proven over his long career. And indeed, that's the basis. But I also thought it can be many other things. So what I'd like to try and discuss today is whether a walk can also be a political act, a spiritual act, perhaps mystical, something romantic. Most of these are terms that he would not use, I hasten to add, and nor are they necessarily the views of my employer. But the idea is that we can talk freely because Richard's not here. What definitely Richard is a conceptual artist, having begun in the late 60s as, I guess, a student of the St. Martin's School. But using this show as an example, I would point to the work behind, which is called Slate, Granite, Sandstone, Limestone, Chalk, which is the long text piece, for those of you who can't see, which is kind of classic Richard, conceptual Richard. So it describes a walk of 240 miles in 8 days from Cornwall all the way across the country. But this is very typical of Richard, that he will start with a premise, with an actual point-to-point linear narrative from which to base his work. And there is a beginning, middle, and end to these works, but having something very specific, like an instruction, made him a conceptual artist. So the idea of the walk was the idea. But along the way, what he came up with was the title, Slate, Granite, Limestone, Chalk. These bits of the countryside that he passed through, it creates a very different image of his work, almost like a landscape or something. So I wanted to kind of discuss what you thought about him as a conceptual artist. I mean, I think that's what he is, but where do you think there's more in there, or do you think that's typical Richard?
I think what's fascinating about Richard's work, and now the opportunity of looking back on it over 3 decades, and I think, it's very interesting for the Lisson to be showing Richard, again, having obviously worked with him very early in his career, and actually this show really covers Richard's territory very holistically in terms of representing the different aspects of his work. He's very much an artist of his generation. You mentioned that he started his career sort of training at the Central St. Martin's, where his peers were Gilbert and George, Hamish Fulton, very much coming out of a very experimental era of rejecting media, in a political sense, with a small p, I think, in terms of wanting to reinvent the very terms of art in the late 60s, when, of course, that was happening, particularly in Britain and in the States. And I think that his work, also shares a strong affinity with what was happening in the States in that period. He's obviously been associated with the land artists, but I think we could talk more about his relationship to Sol LeWitt, for example, because I think that relationship is very interesting, because Sol LeWitt's work also has very clear kind of structure, sets out rules, sets out process, sets out a methodology to follow. But the way in which it's enacted, in his case by drawing on a wall most often, is very much then using the materials for their strength, essentially. So with Sol LeWitt's work, the allolatory line, the sort of very fragility of drawing directly onto the wall. And in Richard's case, in every sense, he is very much setting out a conceptual agenda, which is to set a task and follow it, but then actually where the work comes together and the magic of it, if you like, is then in the encounter with the material and the practical. And I think it's that coalition that sort of, has remained. He's, what's interesting about Richard is that he's not done anything that different for the last 30 years, and yet his work completely seems to sit with each different generation with a lot of resonance in a very interesting way. And I think now that sort of bringing together a conceptual idea with the material feels actually very, very current.
It was interesting that we were both at the Royal College of Art a couple of weeks ago to see the students there, and I saw a couple, I can't remember if I get the names wrong, forgive me, someone called Freya Gabby and someone else called Theo Harper. And she'd made a tree buried in the landscape that it had grown out of, these 6 black and white images. It felt very much like an early Richard Long. And then the other guy had done something like travelled to this stone and then rubbed on the stone until he kind of almost polished it to mirror. And I felt that these were 20-year-olds or 19-year-olds doing this kind of work. And it felt like there was something, continuing. And it's interesting you talk about the material. I mean, if you look at conceptual artists of the 60s, very rigorous, very serious. And I think he identified with Sol LeWitt more than Gilbert and George, let's say, for example, or some of the other guys on his course or some of his other peers. And I don't know whether that's because from a very early point he sort of more aligned to an international style or an international movement of conceptual art rather than a British one. I don't know where you think he stands, because a lot of the work here, and indeed the material of a lot of this work, is British, is local to Richard, is local to Bristol, is stuff that he brings from his own landscape. Where do you see him on the kind of being British or international in scope?
I think there's not that binary opposition. I think that's where the strength and why he's now recognised as one of the most important senior British artists, because there isn't that sort of separating out between the local and the international. And again, that's evidenced in this show, but across his career. I mean, it illustrates with the piece, The Walk 240 Miles, that his homeland is the southwest. I mean, he's lived and worked in Bristol. Many of his, he states very clearly in the different, when he's talked about his work, that Dartmoor is the place where he sort of emphasises physically, I would say probably spiritually in terms of, but also just to sort of enact his work, that it still is incredibly rich for him. But he has also sought out deliberately very remote areas, and I think, again, there's no coincidence that, for him, I think he might see affinity between Dartmoor and then, the top of a mountain in Switzerland, or places that he's visited. I know he's been in the Pyrenees quite often, or, remote parts of India, that actually there are differences, but there are shared experiences as well. And I think he's never thought in that sort of, dare I say, provincial versus international way. And again, I think that was recognised early on. He was sort of seen very much as part of, having an affinity with a much bigger movement that kind of quickly acquired, as Michael Heiser, sort of his work with working with the landscape, Robert Smithson, James Turrell, that ambition in a way, which is there very quietly in a way with Richard's work, but is there, very strongly as well. So
it's good you've mentioned land art, spiritualism, enactment. These are all verboten words. I love it. This is what we're going to get onto in a minute.
It's exactly what Richard would hate.
Yes, but I wanted to talk maybe a bit about this work, which you can all see, called Beyond God, which is the Romanticism walk. And as you said, he's been to many different parts of the world, many sort of remote, secluded places. This happens to be a work in the Alps, north of Tyrol, kind of eastern Switzerland. And what's interesting about this is it's kind of less classic in the way that first piece was, is in the 2 bits of text. I mean, I don't know the pattern. These are all Richard's kind of graphic. I see that as being like a compass, an old-fashioned compass, but the top half are all words that were somehow physical or factual moments in the walk. And then the bottom half are more sort of emotional or experiential things that happened to him along the way. And I didn't know whether there is some room to talk about, you know, the kind of the mystical element of what he does. Because he claims they're sort of self-generating, that the texts just flow, that they come from the walk, that they're part of this. But I can't help feel he's sort of building some sort of, you know, because his career is so long, there's this kind of epicness to it all. I don't know whether we appreciate that sometimes. I don't know if he got a bit sniffy once. One of the British art critics claimed that he didn't actually do any of these walks, that they were just the text piece. That, you know, but there is something kind of mystical and epic about doing these walks, because some of them really are sort of endurance tests. You know, they're proper. Well,
a walk of 240 miles in 8 days is, you know, it's serious, work. And he's, you know, and he's always had that where it is about a direct encounter with nature and a solitary one. You know, again, no coincidence that he chooses these locations that are so far removed from an urban encounter, which is obviously the more common one, and that, you know, and I think there is very much a sort of underlying spirituality that he would, you know, and has mentioned, you know, you can trace back to sort of cave painting, and you know, he sort of obviously referenced an interest in sort of Zen spirituality. Mm-hmm. And that sort of just connecting in a very individual way with nature is definitely just what he does, just in a very straightforward, and then these are the evidence of it, essentially. And I think, you know, that there's two ways in which his work exists. I mean, he obviously doesn't declare the work as performance, because it isn't. When he does the walks, they are simply real-life experiences, but that is as much part of the work as what we then see in the gallery, what happens out there, what is documented by the photographs when he's making the arrangements, again, with a very environmental stance, way before it became sort of a topic, as it were, in the sense of not leaving a physical trace, or if you leave a trace, it's one that can be naturally eroded. That is as much of a part of the work as what are very carefully constructed pieces in the gallery. So again, we can see with this piece or with the piece next door, using very sort of working with systems. So he often uses the circle or the cross or the triangle, these sort of very basic geometric forms, which again is sort of you know, very much stems back to the era of the 60s. So it is this doubling always, that there is the real life. And I agree that he wouldn't share, you know, it's quite far removed from how we might think about Gilbert and George, but I think that sort of very early, that the way they live and work is the work, is very interesting.
That's true, yeah.
I mean, forgive me, because
a walking sculpture.
Yeah, exactly, but in a completely different way, obviously. But actually maybe coming from not a million miles away in terms of a stance.
And I think we often appreciate that generation of St. Martin's trained sculptors as being very much about the dematerialization of sculpture, let's say, or the sort of breaking down of all the rules. But it was interesting that you did talk a bit about how that he obviously revels in the materials, you know, just looking at the work he makes, it's not always coldly conceptual. And you've worked with him on installing pieces a bit like the one next door. Can you explain a bit about his process, or how what he's looking for? I mean, if we look at the one next door, it's made of Delabole slate from Cornwall, which is a giant quarry, and these are kind of offcuts of slate. I guess I don't know exactly what they're being used for. I mean, that's one thing with Richard's work, you don't kind of have that urban sense that these might be offcuts from bits of kitchen worktop or something. You know, it doesn't feel like that. But he obviously arranges them in a very specific way. this piece next door is called Four Ways, and does kind of relate to a crossroad. I mean, it's very literally a cross. And he's talked about the title also, Four Ways, both words having four letters, you know, this system, as you mentioned, you know, being a very sort of strict thing. But when he's actually in the space working on a piece, how does that change from being a kind of conceptual idea? How do you feel that?
Yeah, I mean, I was previously a curator at Tate Britain, and certainly other colleagues there worked with him more closely on different pieces. But the one piece that I did, which I'll talk about a bit, is a recreation of White Water Line, which was a big installation of Devine Galleries. But I do know with these more sculptural pieces that he does think about them in sculptural terms, in the sense, purely in the sense of arranging the stones and selecting the forms in a way that they have a presence in the gallery, that the arrangement makes sense as a physical object. Mm-hmm. Again, you know, within these sort of very clear geometric forms, these kind of primal kind of shapes, as it were, these recurrent shapes. And it is very much, as much as creating, when he's out there in the landscape, a sort of encounter, it is very much an awareness of the encounter of the visitor in the gallery space. Mm-hmm. So it is very deliberately sort of thinking about how you might walk around it, or the presence in the gallery. Because
there's almost like two different ways of doing it, that they are marked out and then they're filled with the material. But he doesn't necessarily, you know, he says that he doesn't always necessarily have to be there to install every work, but he does like to do them himself, suggesting that there is quite a lot of method to what he's doing. Tell us a bit about the work the Devine piece.
Well, that was, yeah, I would just say about the piece next door, it's very interesting that it's Cornish slate as well. And again, I think this sort of empathy, you know, with material, you know, and I think particularly southwest, whether it's, you know, from Cornwall through to Devon, Dartmoor and Bristol, that actually he is very deliberate, again, about, you know, which stones that he selects. He's often worked with the red stones. From a local area as well, with River Avon mud,
which I believe this
is again for him the sort of the mud that he always returns to in terms of locality, but also, you know, for example, the River Avon famously has the very high tide, so it has this sort of force of nature. As well, which is, again, it's not something that I think he would explicitly talk about, but I think that the materials matter, you know, they matter, the kind of locality. So White Water Line was a piece that he originally presented at the Tate Gallery in 1991 when he was awarded the Turner Prize, and he was one of the artists who was very much recognised in the early years of the Turner Prize. He was nominated a few times, and I think if I'm correct, the year that he was actually awarded, he wasn't there at the ceremony. He was off on a walk in the Pyrenees, and this is very much, he doesn't seek to be a public figure in that way.
Quite the opposite.
Quite the opposite. But we invited him to recreate the work when we had the Turner Prize retrospective in 2007, and he remade the work in the gallery, and it was very interesting to work with Richard, and I think that there might be a similarity with the process. For him, it is very much an experience in creating a very particular environment in which he can then create the work. I mean, it was White Water Line, which means pouring continuously the slip, as it were. You can't make any mistakes.
Yeah, sure.
So we did it, you know, late at night. There was no public there. He worked with a technician, senior technician at the Tate, Mikey Hall, who he's worked with for 20 years and is very comfortable with. But beyond that, it was sort of a very, very private experience. And I think that's also very important. And I think, as far as I understand, when these pieces were made, just in one of your workshops here as well, there's a sense of the performative.
Yeah, that's interesting, because
but not performance.
We've also filmed him. He made a mud circle for our presentation at Freeze Masters last year, and we filmed him doing it, and he was comfortable with that, and, you know, the film is a very beautiful thing, but it's not something that he relishes, you know, the idea that people will see him at work. But it's so important for the works themselves. I mean, if you look at the hand markings and the gestures, and, you know, he doesn't call them paintings either, because the first one of these mud works that he made was actually on the floor, I think, again, early 70s, late 60s. So it was for him more of a sculptural thing. They've since been modified to be on museum walls or now on sort of board and canvas. But the idea that he's very much there, they're done incredibly quickly as well, in terms of he's very sure of his own gesture. They're not hesitant or anything. It does seem important, but I suppose what he also talks about is what you were saying, this forces of nature somehow, that when he then tips the canvas up and then lets the gravity do its work, you know, it's sort of a combination between his own energy and just the realities of the water or the gravity or the energy of the gesture that causes something else to happen. And similarly with the small mud drawings upstairs, where they're left to sort of percolate themselves or sort of seep down, that there's a sort of an alignment between him and nature, which is more complicated than strict performance, because performance, we expect it to be out there, we expect it to be done for an audience, but he obviously doesn't revel in that. I'm wondering whether there is this kind of conjoining with nature or something, which sounds a bit pretentious when I say it, but if you're doing it, if you want to try and achieve something, an actual effect.
But I think, you know, Rich is always about the practical. There is a very practical element. You've got a raw canvas or a floor or a wall, and you only get one shot. Yeah. So you need to sort of get into the zone and sort of create something, and that takes a lot of concentration. Yeah. So I think there is always that sort of very practical element, as much as the sort of underlying bigger questions that I think really underpin his practice as well. Which is what he always brings to the fore, the kind of practical and but then, you know, the kind of bigger themes are sort of sitting there always.
I mean, one of the things he talks about his work consisting of materials, ideas, movement and time, which is a good encapsulation, but doesn't allow for these ideas that perhaps we're talking about, you know, this kind of idea of the landscape or the nature, or, you know, he doesn't like the word sublime either, but I'm wondering whether there is something about being with nature that we can learn from these works, or whether there is, because when he becomes more tactile or the gestures become less conceptual. So, I mean, this is an interesting work behind you, the No Direction, Like a Rolling Stone, in which this was, according to him, the first walk he did where there wasn't a set point-to-point idea of where he was going and what he wanted to do. So the words are aimless, wandering, irrational, uncertainty, which is not typical for Richard in terms of having something quite clear and set out. And suggests to me, a lot of those words suggest to me the kind of romantic idea of landscape, or, you know, being a roamer or a drifter or a wanderer. And that's something that he hasn't really done that before. I mean, I don't know whether that's a new thing, but consistently throughout his career, he does introduce new elements. So the diary started becoming a part of his work, so you would actually find out a bit about, you know, him stopping off and having lunch, or where, you know, who he met along the way. And a bit like this one with the title, Like a Rolling Stone, obviously related to music. There are certain works that relate directly to music. There's a piece called Walking Music in 2004, which is just a list of what he's listening to, which is Beatles and Sinead O'Connor, if you're interested. And then I guess also, even though the first ever piece that he sort of cites as being the first moment was a line made by Walking, but then soon after, in 1970, he made a piece of pebbles in Tennessee, in Little Pigeon River, which he then overlaid with text from Johnny Cash's Walking the Line. So he was obviously, you know, the music was a part of that. It wasn't, you know, so conceptual that he was just a line made by Walking. You know, he's also got things going on in his head, and he's got music, and he's got atmosphere and environment.
But again, I think when you look at those references, Bob Dylan, Cash, that kind of counter moment is sort of at the heart of how the work originated and how it's continued. And I think what's fascinating about A Line Made by Walking, which is one of probably the key British artworks in the Tate collection, and yet it's incredibly modest.
It's only about that
and
big,
it's a small photograph, and it was entirely experimental. He got on a train. He went out of London. I don't know if he even can remember the location, but it was basically about 20 miles out of London, choosing a field, making a line by walking. It was sort of very experimental, and yet it so captured a moment that it's become this sort of iconic work. And I think that's sort of very key. And I think, going back to the question of the sublime, I think it is the reason that it's not sublime, and I agree that that's not what he's interested in, as Richard says, is because he's not trying to capture the epic to do with nature, although that does come across, but that's not his intention, to create a kind of summary of the awe of nature, because he's much more interested in the smaller moments. But together they convey an incredibly powerful experience. So some of the words, they are a collection of these very human moments: roam, drift, chance, wandering, irrational, uncertainty. They are very emotional, but they're quite specific as well. So it's not, the question of sublime in the 19th century sense was to sort of capture this sort of overwhelming sense. Whereas actually, I think the strength of Richard's work, and it is interesting where narrative has crept in, because then it does also become much more human, or where you get a sense of what he's listening to, and it is that very human encounter as a way to understand and remind ourselves, of the power of nature, particularly now when, it seems that becomes more and more, to find a remote natural place seems very far removed from daily encounter. So there is a kind of sense of the power of nature, but not, I would say, in a way that relates it back to a sort of 19th century romantic sublime approach. But I think poetry is quite an interesting thing, because in a way, even with the forms, there's a much clearer reference back to 60s concrete poetry in terms of word structure, and maybe, I don't know, I mean, this is complete speculation, but maybe there's you could make more connections historically with poetry. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, interesting that you mention, Bob Dylan, and then these kind of difficult to reach places all in one go. I wonder whether upstairs are some of the works from his first ever trip to the Antarctic. He'd never been there previously. So one of the works upstairs is called A Camp on the Driscoll Glacier, and features, I'd like to say it was just him in this little red tent, but it was him and his guide in a little red tent on the base of this glacier. And again, it's quite a strenuous, arduous bit of work, but the idea that even from the first line made by walking, that he had this sense of leave no trace, that there was never anything meant to be. He wasn't disturbing nature, he was kind of moving through it in a way, creating a line that would then disappear. And even with a lot of the works that he's made recently, so some of the Antarctic works, and often in other places, he will make a line or a circle. So there's another piece upstairs called The Line for a Time and a Place, in which he's placed stones. I think in this case, he threw stones from his vantage point onto this ridge to create a line. But then, partly because of that part of the world he was in, he made the conscious decision to then go and unmake that, even though to us it's a very sort of subtle difference in the landscape. Or, there's evidence of a human hand at work, there's something been, but then he also insists on going to remove that, to destroy that or take that away. And in some cases, his gesture on the landscape is so slight as to be difficult to discern. So another piece of his that I love was, I think it was called 100 Stones, and each mile he would walk, again a British walk from Cornwall, I believe, he would leave one stone each mile as these like marker points, and the stones would have come from Cornwall or along the way. They would have moved. He has altered the environment somehow, but very slightly. We're talking about an object suddenly appearing a mile further down the landscape than where he found it. So that is a conceptual line as much as it's a very slight physical line. But you mentioned that perhaps these are touching on environmental concerns that weren't, I suppose there were very early green movements in the 60s and 70s, but not as we appreciate them now. And obviously any work that's made in the Antarctic or that relates to these kind of things, we assume to be some sort of statement about global warming, or and Richard's never talked about that, but that there is a sense that what he does, well, what he was doing 40 years ago was very much relevant to now, 40 years later.
Yeah, and I'm and I don't think we can talk about it in terms of politics, but I think that underlying Richard's work is an utter respect for nature. I mean, that's basically at the core of it. And also, the relationship between man and nature and what one does to intervene, as you just described, which is very specific in relation to his work. But of course, in terms of environmental concerns, is also at the heart of that tension. And I think that's very much been at the core of, what Richard's negotiating, is that very human, individual, personal relationship with nature, but then speaks to much wider kind of concerns, which now, we can think about in the framework of, political concerns, because they increasingly become a growing crisis, and I think have even escalated in the last 30, 40 years that Richard's been working and are still not being addressed. But I don't, as you say, Richard's never commented on that, but I think that the concerns and what Richard's work reminds us of is to be respectful. I mean, it's sort of as simple as that. And I think a lot of that's why Richard's work resonates quite often. So, because he's just pointing out very simple things, that a sort of a walk on your own through a remote landscape brings you to an encounter with your own emotion as well, and which, I mean, that's quite a list in terms of actually quite anxious or sort of uncertainty, irrational. It sort of places the onus back on you, solitude, decisions. And that reminds us of the human, I think, which is sort of what becomes lost in, and is sort of needs to be reminded constantly with environmental issues, that it's that sort of small gestures thing, small acts, that everything that we do has an effect, and that's sort of what's
this kind of ripple effect
forgotten. Yes.
And also, I suppose some of the sort of genius of some of those ideas, taking a stone with you, or even early works he would make by kind of, rolling snowballs. It's quite a childlike idea of what it is to be in a place. I mean, he talks about growing up on Dartmoor and Bristol as being very important to his work, and, having quite a kind of free childhood to explore. But, the idea that we'd put a shell or a stone in our pocket, or, make a snowman or something, there are these elements to his work as well. And yet on the flip side, some of the pieces can also kind of instill at least some note of danger. We mentioned some of the kind of longer walks, the more arduous walks, but they're always kind of written very sensibly, as though, that was fine. But I couldn't contemplate doing a 240-mile hike, or, many of these things, and sleeping, fairly rough in a tent in driving rain. In some ways it's very stoic and British to do it in that way. But like you said, he's not aiming for some sort of pat on the back in terms of a heroic gesture. The marks he's making and the marks he's leaving are very subtle in some ways. And
again, it's a mixture of things. He clearly enjoys, and that comes across in the walk. Again, just looking at the piece there, it says play, transformation, throwing a stone, complete childlike pleasure in sort of throwing a stone. So that, again, is very much, there's again this tension which is very human, this sort of balance between, enjoyment and enjoying the process, which is clear, I don't think he would continue to do it if that wasn't at the heart of it, but then it sort of brings you to different extremes. But it's not Bear Grylls. He's not sort of doing it for
surviving on eating
endurance, for the point of sort of stoicism. Yeah. But it is about putting yourself in a situation, I think, that means that you do encounter lots of different emotions, as well as just the practical sort of enjoyment of going through, going on a hike, as it were.
The idea of the stoical is quite interesting because some of the work does, it is minimal, it's stark, it's done often through the least means possible. So the idea that you could have a great big epic adventure and complete it in one line is also, I suppose that was coming from the time of his generation of work in sculptures, the minimalism. The idea was, that it could be, the world could be referenced in simple, clean objects. But in some ways, Richard has always even been more radical than that by sort of eschewing the object. It's different when we have a work in a gallery or physical work in the world, because in some ways that exists at least on a sort of more semi-permanent basis than the works that he does out in the world. He doesn't seem to differentiate between the two, between the site of the landscape, making something in the world and then taking it apart or leaving it to scatter, and then bringing work into the gallery. I think I read something about how they're both, in some ways, quite alien worlds. They're both, this is a sort of harsh environment in some ways, the white walls and the stone floors, that they are in some ways as alien as what he's encountering in the wilds of the terrain. I don't know whether it feels, it's not very dangerous working in an art gallery, I should point out. You don't have to make kind of desperate...
But I think there is, again, that precision in the work, in what he does. He doesn't see it as binary or sort of... But he does think very specifically about what he does, whether it's putting objects in a gallery or text on a wall or creating a mud work, in the same way that he does think very carefully about what he might do in the landscape. It's just it's sort of about precision and about context. And I think he said that it's not about being site specific, certainly not in the gallery, because things can be relocated or remade or and in his work is owned in collections across the world, and therefore become visible and become enjoyed by a public, which of course isn't possible in a remote corner of Switzerland or in different areas. So that is equally important. But it's about a precision about what you do and the choices that you make, and a responsibility, I suppose, in terms of what objects you use as well and how you present them. So I think that is maybe the connecting thread, if you like.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Certainly the way he puts together his shows, that he is very precise. All the lettering, everything is done by him. He's fully in control. I wonder whether there is something between the public face of what he does and the private face, which is, as we said, he doesn't particularly like to be, I wouldn't say he was completely anonymous, but in his work he doesn't like to have his personality involved, or perhaps the minutiae of what he's up to. And then that also reflects on what he does in private. Seems to be a different way of experiencing his work, because he obviously engaged in the landscape, making something, and then he'll occasionally take a photograph of it and send it out. But there's a lot within his work that remains untold. It's not like a sort of a constant spew of consciousness, a diary of what he's doing all the time. It's very specific. He picks the specific moment of the walk in which he discovers a butterfly, or there's only moments. And I suppose maybe that's why we've kind of discussed some of the things that it might or might not be minimal, spiritual, political, but this conceptual idea that there is something that can spark something off in your own head that can create something, create a space, give you a link to another world or another landscape that is so powerful, that's so that he manages to do so well.
Yeah, and I think it is that sort of tipping point between there is narrative in it, and you do feel his own presence clearly in the work, but it's not biographical. It's not. I mean, universal is one of those slightly woolly words, but the kind of the terms that he's using, or the emotions that he's referencing, or the sort of encounters, you can empathise. Anyone can empathise with. I think so. It's that sort of. He's not, it's not sort of biographical, although, again, clearly it relates to a lot of the work does relate to, his care for the region in which he lives. But it's not a sort of biographical narrative. It's more sort of sharing on a much more sort of universal level what can be shared experiences. I don't know if that sort of makes sense.
No, that's true, because actually in many cases these walks aren't solitary. He does them with other people, and walking is a constant in his life. It's not something that sometimes he does set out, I think, to do something specifically on his own, but he also talks about meeting amazing people on the way. These don't make it into his works because it's not really, like you're saying, this kind of narrative idea, but meeting a guide in Nepal or somewhere, a young boy who helps him traverse a particularly treacherous path or something, they're all part of the story, but not part of the work somehow.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, there are some works that are quite unusual. You mentioned the piece upstairs with the tent, and that evidence of that sort of kind of very practical aspect to the walk isn't usually in there. It's more, he takes out of it much more abstracted concerns usually. But then it's very interesting, and I'm sure that decision to do that in that case was again thinking about that landscape, which is so famously untouched and yet becoming more vulnerable in terms of human intervention. So I think just very lightly the decisions that he makes are very pointed. But I think his work still does resonate to a sort of current generation. Forgive me, I will mention an artist we're showing currently at the ICA, Paulo Nazareth, who is a Brazilian artist whose work is premised on walking.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And he is currently doing a 5-year walk across Africa, which is tracing, he also has African heritage, and so a lot of his work's concerned with sort of following those connections in the work as well. And his work manifests in essentially a collection of ephemera, and very much about these kind of very specific anecdotal, local encounters, evidenced by sort of, packaging or drawings that he's made, or little videos, or... And again, it's sort of, it's very interesting, because I think that Paulo's work relates very much and is very aware of artists like Richard Long and, that sort of conceptual artist generation, but then he approached it in a very different way, from a much more kind of personal and biographical aspect as well. And I think that's when you can sort of see, and Richard's work has changed over the years as well. In a way, it's constant, but it, in a sort of with specific details, he is responsive to different situations as well.
How does this artist, forgive me because I haven't seen the show, but how does he install the work? Is it like a sort of archive type way of...
Yeah, he normally doesn't install himself because he's off.
He's still walking. Doing
the walk. Yeah. So again, it's sort of...
Sounds familiar.
It's not, he's another artist who there's not a separation between, okay, now I'm doing a performance for a couple of hours.
Yeah.
It's
constantly...
It's constant, and that's...
it's interesting.
But it was fascinating because his gallery, Mendes Wood, Matthew Wood, and another of the directors who often install the work, they sort of laid out according to instruction. Then they had a 2-hour Skype conversation with Paulo, which is 21st century way of working with artists, and actually, interestingly, very environmentally concerned as well. But he is quite precise, and a lot of you know, and I think you'll see the nod to a sort of, you know, conceptual legacy. It's quite ordered, the way that, you know, these different packets and things. And again, a sort of underlying environmental concern. One of the pieces laid out is these plastic packages, which a lot of people in Africa and other areas of a developing world, that's how they have water, is in plastic packages. So it's that. So he's sort of fascinated with this sort of dichotomy between sort of nature and how it's sort of received as well.
It's interesting you picked up on the tent in the glacier piece, because there is also a strange kind of sly nod to Richard's last exhibition here 30 odd years ago, when he also made a piece with a tent. I think he was on a walk in Spain or somewhere, which also, I think it ended up on our private view card. So on the top you had the 1960, whatever it was, or 1970 version of this card, and then the 2014 version, you know, the sort of, and again the tent was a sort of old canvas one, and now it's a much more technologically advanced, I don't know what they're made out of.
Which you would need in the
Antarctic, I would hope so, yeah. But there's, you know, I think these are things that are in there, but they're not explicit, you know. And possibly why Richard doesn't always like talking about his work is because people try and drag these things out of him, and they should be left there for us to discover. So I just want to ask, if anyone wants to ask a question, prepare, because Nolly will come round with a microphone in a minute. Sorry, what were you going to add something there?
Well, just that I don't think that's for Richard the most interesting aspect.
Yeah.
I think again he always brings it back to the practical as well, but for him that's not the thing to sort of convey in the gallery necessarily. Sure. He's sort of
Does anyone want to ask anything? You've got a question? Burning one at the back from Jane. Yeah.
I wondered if we could touch on the aspect of ritual in Richard's work, because although you talk about the practical, I think there's something inherently important about ritual, especially in things like the mud paintings, the wall paintings. I think they have an almost shamanistic sort of quality. I mean, he is, as you say, getting in a zone, and I think there is a sense, very much a sense of ritual. I've never discussed it with Richard, so
you wouldn't get very far with the shaman thing. I think because of Joseph Beuys was obviously a big figure at that time, and the idea somehow that the artist could, again, I guess that's based on the artist as a personality or something as well, that Richard didn't feel comfortable with those ideas. But yeah, I can see that. I can see, you know, in terms of focus, I don't know how ritualistic he is in terms of working. These are obviously produced, you know, as you put it, in the zone, you know, very quickly and very sort of, he has a program in which he knows how to create them. But I'm not sure that, apart from having the set idea of a program or a schedule or a map in his mind of where the walk or the piece will take him, I don't know whether his kind of working method is that ritual. I don't think he really has a studio, you know, as we know it, as artists tend to have studios. He doesn't work in a particularly kind of structured way. It's very precise, but he's not kind of getting up in the morning and doing this kind of, you know, this work all the time. It tends to be responsive, reactive to where he's been or what he's done. I don't know what you think.
Well, I mean, it has been discussed whether it comes from him, but I think we were talking earlier. He was one of the few British artists in the Magician de la Terre exhibition in 1986, which was a pretty controversial exhibition, but was very much sort of about a new idea of internationalism. And, for example, it had Aboriginal artists who made ritualistic work in a way I think that you're looking towards. And it included Richard. And I think it was sort of trying to, at the time, align contemporary art with more ancient forms of art practice. And I think, although he probably wouldn't talk about it that much, it's definitely there. I mean, he's talked about some of his work in relation to cave painting, which, of course, we don't necessarily know why those cave paintings were even made. We can speculate. But so I think he does see himself in that longer tradition. But again, I think he just wouldn't necessarily talk about it, and definitely wouldn't talk about it in a way. I would again speculate that he, Joseph Beuys, who was, very much foregrounding that and making that part of the sort of, dare I say, theatricality of the work, is very oppositional to Richard's stance. But I think he would sort of, I would think he is interested in that territory. And ritual, even in the sense of setting yourself a task and doing it, which is, what a lot of religious rituals are about. Again, that sort of just basic approach. But he wouldn't make those connections directly. Does that make sense?
I totally misunderstood the question in terms of ritual, but you're right in terms of putting one foot after the next, and those kind of old Chinese proverbs about where a walk will take you. He's very much into that. I got carried away with the kind of rituals of getting up in the morning and having your toast and stuff like that. I got it totally backwards.
I think I was getting into the more sort of shamanistic and the links with sort of ancient art. And I was thinking, I've been doing some work lately on the School of Altamira, where Miro and Artigas people met after the war. And there's this sort of link between contemporary art of the time and cave painting. And I was sort of wondering if Richard, as I say, it's not something I've discussed with him. We did discuss an artist called Stubbing once who was part of Altamira, and we talked about this sort of crossover because he also worked with his hands. So I just wondered if he'd ever been vocal about that sort of aspect of it, which is slightly closer to the spiritual rather than ritual in terms of sort of, as you say, the one foot after the other, or the superstitious ritual. I was thinking more of something more inherently spiritual, I guess.
Any other questions? There's one at the back here, if you could pass it along. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, I have a question about inspiration. You've talked about response to materials, a reactive thing, but also you touched on relating to music. And I think, is it important that we have to read into works like this beyond the surface and beyond the obvious? And in fact, sources of inspiration are quite important. Is this not something that's common to a lot of different forms of creative activity? I'm thinking of musicians, for example, who are like Delius, inspired by the walk to his local pub. Actually it's all about nature, that piece. But the inspiration, as you've pointed out here, is very much to do with the experience of what is seen on the way. And I think it's interesting that with this very minimal work, there are still these layers of inspiration. Is there a commonality across art forms in that sense?
That's difficult. That would be hard for me to say. In terms of musicality, I think you could read some of that into Richard's work, but I also think that, like a piece of music or like a landscape painter, it's not necessarily what he sees that comes out of the work. It's often an atmosphere or something, something intangible that he manages to get through very few words, through minimal gestures. I think the connection to the landscape is there, but it's not obvious. It's not done. Or sometimes it is very obvious, and so obvious that actually it's evocative. I don't know, where do you stand on the kind of cross-disciplinary...
I think, obviously that would sort of be a question to pose to Richard in terms of how he... which clearly, I am not Richard. But I think in terms of... It'd be interesting to know, because, to reference clearly Bob Dylan or other artists, but as nature as an inspiration clearly cuts across centuries and across art forms. And I think it's just then a matter of how you address it. And it's fascinating and hopeful that I would say that it continues to inspire in 2014, when there's a lot more attention on technology and, urban encounters, etc. But again, how that's articulated, I think, is very distinct to Richard. And would be quite different. But I think there, obviously there is something about an encounter with nature that you can find in Friedrich, or you can find in Wordsworth, or you can find in composers. But it would be forcing it, I think, to sort of make those more direct connections to Richard's work. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's great. And does anyone else have any questions? Because it's 12:30, so I don't want to keep people. And far from me to say, apart from not being Richard Long, I would like to thank Katharine for being here today, and she's given us lots of interesting things to think about Richard's work, but also at least 2 or 3 good reasons to go to the ICA, not least to see the walking work, but also the artist film biennial. So please give me a quick round of applause for Katharine.